Hey everybody! In this module we're going to focus on plants that produce specialized storage organs that we can use for propagation purposes. In this first unit in the module we're just going to learn what the different storage organs are, and we'll talk about how to use them for propagation in the next unit. It's important to know what the structures are and what their general morphology is, because this helps us decide what our propagation technique is going to be. This module follows on nicely from the previous module on divisions and separation, as these are two of the propagation techniques that we can use on some of the plants that produce specialized storage organs. By the end of this unit, you'll be able to describe the main physical characteristics of bulbs, corms, rhizomes, stem tubers, and root tubers. But let's start with a little bit of general background first of all. Over the course of evolution, plants have developed many strategies for coping with environmental stresses. One adaptation is the geophytic growth form, where a plant dies back to an underground storage organ and goes dormant during periods that are unfavorable for plant growth, such as prolonged heat, drought, or cold. The storage organ's main function is the storage of carbohydrates and water during these adverse environmental conditions. We often refer to all geophytic plants as bulbs, but this isn't technically correct. In addition to true bulbs, geophytes also includes corms, rhizomes, and tubers. We're going to go through descriptions of these storage organs now, so you know what the differences are between them. And I'll also give you some common plant examples of each of them so that you can put them into context. Before that though, let's take a quick look at where geophytes grow naturally. Some geophytes can be found growing in winter deciduous forests. These are forests dominated by trees that lose their foliage during the winter. Underground storage organs allow plants that occupy the forest floor to develop vegetative and floral organs really quickly before the leaf canopy of the trees fills in spring and light becomes the limiting factor for plant growth. The photo on the right shows a deciduous forest in the south of England with the aptly named bulb bluebells in full bloom. These bulbs put on all of their vegetative growth and bloom early in the spring, usually around April, before the leaves on the trees, which are usually beech trees, fully open. It's really a spectacular sight to see a carpet of bluebells in the spring. Underground storage organs allow plants to develop vegetative and floral organs quickly, where the short duration of the growing season and winter cold are the limiting environmental factors. Well-known examples of geophytes which do this and have become common in cultivation are tulip, imperial fritillary, crocus, and snowdrops. The photo on the right shows imperial fritillary, Fritillaria imperialis, in its native habitat in Iran, where it's actually become rare in the wild because of grazing by domesticated sheep and overcollection of the bulbs by humans. There are 5 regions of the world which are classified as having a Mediterranean-type climate: the Mediterranean Basin, most of California, the Cape region of South Africa, parts of coastal Chile, and parts of South and Southwestern Australia. A Mediterranean-type climate is typified by mild wet winters and long, dry, hot or warm summers. For plants growing in these Mediterranean-type climates, there's a relatively short growing season between the time when conditions for growth are favorable in the spring and the onset of heat and drought in the summer. Underground storage organs allow plants to develop vegetative and floral organs quickly before the lack of water and high summer temperatures become the limiting factors for plant growth. The world's highest concentration of indigenous geophytes is in South Africa's Cape province, which is home to over 1,300 species of geophyte. In California, we have just 240 native bulb and cormus species. The top photo on the right here shows the cormus plant Diorama pulcherrimum, or angel's fishing rod, which is native to South Africa. This is a really pretty, very graceful plant, which is actually more or less evergreen in California, and we have several planted at Cabrillo in the Southern Hemisphere garden. The bottom photo is of our California native corm, Dipterostemon capitatum, or blue dix, which is a common bulb in coastal grassland plant communities. Geophytes include several economically important horticultural crops. Probably the most familiar are the bulb, cut flower, and potted plant crops, such as daffodils and tulips, which are important in the Netherlands, England, Canada, and parts of the US, including Oregon and Washington. Like many sectors of the horticultural industry, the cut flower market for stems produced from geophytes is increasingly global, with the bulbs often being produced in the Netherlands or the Southern Hemisphere, then exported to countries such as the US and Canada for growing on in highly automated greenhouse operations for cut flower production. There are also several food crops of economic importance that produce specialized storage organs, such as potato, sweet potato, yams, onion, garlic, ginger, saffron, which comes from crocus bulbs, and turmeric. In California, geophyte crops of economic importance include garlic, many cut flower and ornamental crops. Retail nurseries also sell fall and spring blooming bulbs, and most of these have been grown in large, highly mechanized operations in the Netherlands, but some have also been grown on the East Coast in the US and in the Pacific Northwest. There are some small specialty growers in California and the US of unusual and hard to find bulbs and corms that you typically can't find in large growers' catalogs because it's just not economically viable for them to produce small crops of niche market plants. Telos Rare Bulbs in Ferndale, California has an excellent choice of fascinating and unusual bulbs from California and South Africa for people looking to try something different. And the Pacific Bulb Society has a good list of suppliers on their website. Locally, Elkhorn Gardens in North Monterey County produces dahlia tubers for mail order across the country, and Santa Cruz Dahlias is a local breeder of new dahlia cultivars. And this picture on the right of KA's Burgundy Bird has been bred by Kathleen Albrecht, who's the owner of Santa Cruz Dahlias. Up until 2018, the world's largest breeder of Xanthodeschia, or calla lily, was Golden State Bulb Growers, which was based right here on the Central Coast in Moss Landing. And for those of you interested in horticultural history, Capitola at one time was the self-dubbed begonia capital of the world. Let's look now at the different types of storage organs and the physical characteristics which distinguish them from each other. And let's start with bulbs. As mentioned earlier, bulb is often used as a generic term to describe several specialized storage organs. But a true bulb is actually a very specific type of storage organ. Bulbs are compressed stems with modified fleshy leaves referred to as scales. The scales serve as the primary storage site for carbohydrates, nutrients, organic compounds, and water. The compressed stem forms a basal plate at the bottom of the bulb, right here. And this contains a growing point and adventitious roots. The scales are attached to the basal plate, as you can see in the diagram. An onion is a bulb, so think about what an onion looks like when you're looking at this diagram. Or better still, go to the kitchen, cut an onion in half vertically, and you'll see almost exactly what this diagram on the right is showing you. Some bulbs have thick, fleshy, contractile roots, whose function is to pull the bulb to the correct depth in the soil. These contractile roots don't play a role in supplying water and nutrients to the bulbs, though. Bulb size varies greatly between species. Mature amaryllis bulbs can be up to around 5 inches in diameter, whereas mature bulbs of our California native Calochortus might be just 3/8 of an inch in diameter. Many bulbs naturally self-propagate vegetatively by producing bulbils or offsets, which are small bulbs growing around the base of the mother bulb. Daffodil bulbs do this, and tulip bulbs do this too, and these offsets can easily be separated from the mother bulb for propagation purposes. These offsets will increase in size until they reach their mature size. And for some species, it may be several years before offsets bloom, although it usually takes less time than growing the plant from seed. Of course, if the bulb is a hybrid, then growing from seed isn't an option if you're wanting to clonally reproduce the parent plant. Bulbs can be divided into two groups depending on their outer structure. They can be classified as either tunicate or non-tunicate. Tunicate bulbs have a dry, papery outer membrane that protects the inner fleshy scales. Examples of species with tunicate bulbs include daffodil, tulip, amaryllis, onion, garlic, and shallot. In the photo, you can see the tunicate bulbs of a daffodil cultivar. Note how the bulb is covered with brown, dry, papery layers, just like an onion. If you look closely, you can see the ridge of the basal plate and the remnants of last season's roots attached to the basal plate. In contrast, non-tunicate bulbs have no papery membrane. This makes them much more susceptible to damage during lifting or digging, cleaning, packaging, and shipping, so they usually have to be handled much more carefully than tunicate bulbs. This means they're usually more expensive because they're more labor-intensive to produce and to ship. Non-tunicate bulbs are also much more susceptible to drying out because they don't have that papery membrane around them. Lilies are a good example of non-tunicate bulbs, and you can see a lily bulb on the right, and the individual scales are very clearly evident there. Here are 3 examples of plants which produce non-tunicate bulbs. Easter lilies, which I've already mentioned. In the bottom right, there's our native leopard lily, and then to the left of that, there's the snake's head fritillary. Let's talk now about corms. Corms are really easy to confuse with bulbs. They have a very similar appearance, but they consist mainly of compressed stem tissue rather than leaf tissue. They usually have a dry outer covering, which is somewhat similar to tunicate bulbs. But if you remove that, you can often see the internodes and lateral buds at the nodes. Unlike a bulb, the stem tissue that makes up a corm is metabolized by the plant to provide the energy for above-ground growth, and a new mother corm is formed each year above the old corm. In addition, small cormlets or cormels are produced around the central corm and can be separated for propagation purposes. Corms, again, usually have contractile roots which pull the new mother corm down to the appropriate depth in the soil. These contractile roots can be distinguished from the true roots by their ridges, which help to pull the bulb down. In commercial corm production, modifying the environmental conditions can increase the size of the new mother corm and the quantity of cormels produced. Examples of plants which grow from corms include crocus, diorama, watsonia, romulea, gladiolus, ixia, and brodea. Rhizomes are swollen stems that grow horizontally, either at or just below the soil surface. Whereas bulbs and corms are more or less rounded in shape, rhizomes are more or less cylindrical-ish. They can vary in thickness from less than the thickness of a pencil to about 1.5 to 2 inches in diameter, depending on the species. In the basic botany exercise you did a few weeks ago, you labeled the nodes and internodes on sections of stems from woody plant species. The anatomy of a rhizome is very similar. It just looks different to those aerial stems. A rhizome has nodes and internodes, just like above-ground stems. But the leaves on rhizomes are reduced to small, scale-like structures. In the axils of these leaf scales, there's an axillary bud. Given the right environmental conditions, new vegetative growth sprouts from these axillary buds. Unlike bulbs and corms, rhizomes usually have many growing points and can be propagated by dividing them into sections. The diagram here shows a rhizome of ginger, which is the part we eat when we buy fresh ginger. And the photo shows the rhizome of a bearded iris. You can see last season's growth here on the bearded iris, and then the new shoots here and a little one there perhaps, which are going to become next season's stems and leaves. If we wanted to, we could probably divide this rhizome one more time, and then it would sprout from these shoots here. Most rhizomatous plants can be divided by division. Although this is a labor-intensive process, many plants are still commercially propagated in this way. Common examples in California nurseries include our native Douglas iris, which is pictured here on the right, and the Pacific Coast hybrid irises, also bearded iris, canna lilies, clivia, and some of the yuccas, which form basal rosettes, and some of the bamboos. Tubers are strange-looking structures. They're specialized storage organs that can grow from either swollen stem tissue or swollen root tissue. You probably see tubers every time you go to the store and walk down the produce aisle, because potatoes, sweet potatoes, Jerusalem artichokes, and yams are all tubers. Potatoes and yams are stem tubers, and sweet potatoes are root tubers. Let's start talking about tubers by talking about tuberous stems. Stem tubers are produced by an enlargement of the hypocotyl section of the seedling plant, but it may also include the first nodes of the epicotyl and the upper section of the primary root. The hypocotyl is the section of stem between the radicle, which, if you remember, is the root that emerges from a seed, so here, and the section of stem up to the first pair of cotyledons, which emerge from the seedling. The epicotyl is the next section of stem above that, so the section of stem between the cotyledons here and then the first pair of true leaves. And then the enlarged hypocotyl, which is the tuberous stem, is going to be about there. In the photo on the right, you can see the enlarged hypocotyl of a cyclamen, which is a popular small plant for seasonal color in the winter. You saw vast quantities of cyclamen being grown from seed in the short video that was filmed at Kawahara Nurseries in Gilroy. Stem tubers are the same anatomically as aerial or above ground stems. They just look very different to what we normally think of as stems. Stem tubers have internodes and nodes from which eyes or shoots develop, and each eye is a meristematic area containing one or more shoot buds. Many plants with tuberous stems can be propagated asexually by dividing the tuber into sections. Each section should contain one or more eyes, or meristems. The cut surface is susceptible to infection by pathogens, so the cut sections are often stored in a warm, moist environment before planting at about 68 degrees Fahrenheit, and this allows the cut surface to heal or to suberize to protect it from pathogens. The photo here shows a really old hybrid begonia at Cabrillo, which has 3 very, very large stem tubers. Because this begonia is a hybrid between 2 different species, Begonia boliviensis and Begonia cinnabarina, it can't be reproduced by seed. It has to be propagated vegetatively, so that means dividing the stem tubers. Caladiums are a good example of a popular plant that produces and is commercially propagated by stem tubers. Most of the caladium production in the US is in Florida because that's where the environmental conditions are at their best for reproducing this particular plant. So let's talk about tuberous roots. A tuberous root is an enlarged fleshy root modified as a storage organ, with shoots produced at one end and roots produced at the other. Examples of plants with tuberous roots are sweet potato, dahlia, and anemone. Herbaceous peonies are also propagated from root tubers, but you don't often see this plant in much of California because it needs prolonged periods of winter chill to initiate flower buds. So it just doesn't get cold enough for long enough in most of coastal California. Unlike stem tubers, most root tubers have no buds, so they can't be used on their own for propagation. However, the stems at the proximal end of the tubers do have buds, and a clump of root tubers can be propagated by dividing the clump so that each tuber has at least one bud attached to it. The photo shows a clump of tubers from a dahlia. You can clearly see the root tubers and the eyes at the base of the crown, which have already started to push on some growth. So you can tell this photo was probably taken in spring because dahlias go dormant over the winter. The clump here could probably be divided into 4 or 5 tubers, each with an eye. And these eyes will be next season's vegetative shoots, the leaves and the stems. Looking at this photo here, you can see that the amount of propagation material is quite limited when you're working with dahlias. And a better method of propagation for dahlias, where you end up with more material, is to clonally propagate them from stem cuttings. I mentioned in the previous slide that unlike stem tubers, most root tubers have no buds, so they can't be used for propagation. A tuberous root that does have buds, though, is the sweet potato, which produces adventitious shoots at the proximal end. Around 60% of the sweet potatoes sold in the US are grown in North Carolina, which is one of the few states that has the right environmental conditions in the summer to make commercial production financially viable. Beds are planted with sweet potato tubers and then covered with plastic. When the tubers begin to form shoots, the plastic's removed to allow the shoots to grow. When those shoots are about 10 inches tall, they're cut and then planted directly in the ground as stem cuttings. So the crop of sweet potatoes that ends up being harvested for sale is actually grown from stem cuttings. Here's a summary of what's been covered in this unit. Over the course of evolution, plants have developed many strategies for coping with environmental stresses. One adaptation to heat, drought, or cold is the geophyte growth form, where a plant dies back to a storage organ and goes dormant during periods that are unfavorable for growth. The storage organ is usually underground, but can be just at the soil surface. Its main function is the storage of carbohydrates, nutrients, and water during periods of environmental stress. We often incorrectly refer to all geophytic plants as bulbs, but more accurately, geophytes include bulbs, corms, rhizomes, and stem and root tubers, which all have very different morphologies. Plants with specialized storage organs are found in many different habitats, from alpine ecosystems to areas with Mediterranean-type climates to evergreen and deciduous forests. As propagators, we can use many of these storage organs for propagation purposes, often using division or separation techniques. The next unit in this module explains some of the propagation techniques that we can use with storage organs. So when you have time, head over to that unit to learn more about those propagation techniques.